Throughout American history, there have been 15 significant assassinations and attempted assassinations of U.S. presidents and presidential candidates. And there have been many more less notable attempts that have been stopped before they became public knowledge. From Andrew Jackson to Donald Trump, these assassinations and attempted assassinations are sadly far from rare occurrences. For the first known attempt on the life of a U.S. president, we have to go all the way back to January 30th, 1835. It was then that President Andrew Jackson was at the U.S. Capitol to attend the funeral of Congressman Warren Davis. And as President Jackson was leaving the funeral, Richard Lawrence brandished a pistol, aimed it at the president, and pulled the trigger. The percussion cap exploded with a loud bang, but the bullet failed to discharge from the gun. Now, instead of running away, the 67-year-old Jackson raised his cane and charged at the would-be assassin. And Lawrence quickly drew a second pistol, but by the grace of God, it also failed to function properly. And he was subdued by several bystanders, including Congressman Davy Crockett. Lawrence was found guilty by reason of insanity and spent the rest of his life in a mental institution. And what are the odds of both guns misfiring, you might ask? Well, that would be 125,000 to 1. And when tested later, both guns did fire properly. Talk about dodging a bullet.
Oh, dodge that bullet.
And although the attempt on Jackson's life was unsuccessful, the attempt on the next president's life, unfortunately, it would be. On Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln became the first U.S. president to be assassinated. It happened at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. during a performance of the play, Our American Cousin. At around 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer, entered the presidential box where Lincoln, his wife, and two others were watching the play. He withdrew a Derringer from his pocket and at point-blank range shot the president in the head. He jumped from the presidential box onto the stage shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, before fleeing the theater. And President Lincoln remained in a coma for about 9 hours before passing away on April 15th. The assassination was found to be part of a broader conspiracy that included plots to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. The manhunt for Booth concluded on April 26 when he was shot and killed in a barn in Virginia. Less than 20 years later, after the death of President Lincoln, President James Garfield was also assassinated. His death occurred on September 19, 1881, but the shooting that led to it occurred almost 3 months earlier. And President Garfield was at the Baltimore and Potomac train station in Washington, D.C. on July 2nd. The assassin, Charles J. Goodyear, described as emotionally disturbed, shot Garfield twice with a .44 caliber British Bulldog revolver. And doctors quickly arrived and began to probe the wounds with unsterilized fingers and instruments. And of course, this led to an infection which spread throughout Garfield's body, leading to his death 80 days later. The assassin was found guilty and hanged on June 30th, 1882. Within 20 years, the United States would see a third U.S. president killed when on September 6, 1901, President William McKinley was shot by a 28-year-old anarchist while he was shaking hands at a public reception. He died 8 days later. McKinley was succeeded by his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, who, on October 14, 1912, was himself shot while campaigning in Milwaukee. The would-be assassin, John Schrank, had been stalking Roosevelt for weeks. And when he felt the time had finally come, Schrank pulled out a .38 caliber Colt Police Positive Special revolver and fired once at the president. And the bullet entered his chest after passing through a metal eyeglass case and the 50-page speech that Roosevelt was preparing to give. Now, despite having just been shot and with the bullet still lodged inside his chest, Roosevelt proceeded to give his planned speech. He opened with this statement: "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Now, while blood flowed from his wound, the president continued on for 84 minutes, before finally agreeing to accept medical attention. And John Schrank was arrested and put on trial. And this is where it gets weird. He claimed that William McKinley had visited him in a dream and told him to avenge his assassination by killing Roosevelt. Yes, the very same William McKinley who had been murdered 11 years earlier.
That sounds crazy.
In the span of 47 years, 3 United States presidents had been assassinated, and an attempt was made to kill a fourth. Now you might be asking yourself, where was the Secret Service during all of this? Isn't it their job to protect the president from being killed? And the short answer to that question is yes. But they weren't given the mission of protecting the president until 1901, after the McKinley assassination. And prior to that, they existed to combat the rampant counterfeiting that threatened the U.S. economy in the aftermath of the Civil War. And with the exception of letting Theodore Roosevelt get shot, I think they did a pretty good job. And that is until November 22nd, 1963. But before we get to that, there's another attempted assassination of a Roosevelt, this one being President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was February 1933, just after giving his speech, where Roosevelt was shot 5 times by Giuseppe Zangara. Thankfully, all 5 missed their intended target, but they did hit several other people, to include Chicago Mayor Anton Chermak, who unfortunately died of his wounds. On to November 22nd, 1963, and probably the most famous assassination of a public official in world history. As President John F. Kennedy's motorcade was entering Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, Lee Harvey Oswald was perched in a room on the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository building, armed with a Carcano Model 9138 with a 4x18 scope mounted on top. As the motorcade passed, Oswald fired 3 shots, 2 of which struck Kennedy, one passing through him and also striking Texas Governor John Connally, who was riding in the front seat of the limo. And Kennedy was immediately rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Now, Oswald, a former Marine and a communist, was arrested a short time later, but would never go to trial. 2 days after the assassination, as he was being transported to the county jail, Oswald himself was shot and killed by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner with ties to the mafia. The Warren Commission, established to investigate the assassination, concluded that Oswald had acted alone. However, other investigations suggest that he may have been part of a larger conspiracy. What makes the Kennedy assassination stand out above the others is that the entire incident was captured on video. And unlike Lincoln's murder, we can see it unfold before our very eyes, rather than just read about it. Even Oswald's death was recorded. It played out on live television in real time. And as we look back in time through the lens of history, Kennedy's death seemed to mark the end of innocence in America and the beginning of a series of high-profile assassinations in the 1960s. In fact, Kennedy's own brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was one of them. On June 5, 1968, after just winning the California Democratic primary, and just minutes after delivering his victory speech, Kennedy was walking through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He was approached by a 24-year-old Palestinian man named Sirhan Sirhan. And Sirhan, armed with an Ivor Johnson .22 long rifle revolver, shot Kennedy multiple times. And 26 hours later, he succumbed to his injuries. Sirhan was convicted of his crimes and remains in prison to this day. And RFK's death led Congress to change the mandate of the Secret Service to include the protection of presidential candidates. But even with the added protection, it is extremely difficult to stop a motivated assassin. And on May 15, 1972, it was a motivated assassin named Arthur Bremer who shot presidential candidate George Wallace at a campaign event in Maryland. And Wallace would survive, but would be paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. On September 5th, 1975, Lynette Squeaky Fromm attempted to shoot President Ford in Sacramento, but her gun malfunctioned. And 2 weeks later, Sarah Jane Moore shoots at Ford in San Francisco, but she thankfully missed. On March 30th, 1981, another high-profile assassination was caught on camera. And just 2 months after being inaugurated, President Ronald Reagan was walking out of the Washington Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., when 25-year-old John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots at him from a .22 caliber ROM RG-14 revolver. One of the bullets ricocheted off the limousine Reagan was about to get into, striking him under his left arm. The bullet broke a rib, punctured a lung, and caused serious internal bleeding. However, Reagan would survive, making him the first president to survive being shot while in office. 3 others were also struck by bullets. Hinckley's motives for the shooting? Well, it wasn't a beef he had with Reagan. Rather, he wanted to impress actress Jodie Foster, who he had become infatuated with. And thankfully, the attempt on Reagan would be the last significant assassination attempt on a president or presidential candidate for the next 43 years. But that would all come to an end on July 13th, 2024, when Thomas Matthew Crooks fired multiple shots from an AR-15 style rifle at former president and current presidential candidate Donald Trump at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. 1 bullet struck Trump in the right ear, while 3 others struck audience members, killing 1 and seriously wounding 2 others. 2 months later, a second attempt was made on the life of Trump. This time, it happened at his golf course in West Palm Beach, Florida. The alleged would-be assassin, Ryan Wesley Ruth, was spotted with an SKS-style rifle in the bushes near holes 5, 6, and 7. The Secret Service agent who spotted him fired multiple rounds, causing him to flee the area in a Nissan SUV. And thanks to an alert witness who saw the suspect flee the area and took a picture, Ruth was spotted and apprehended a short time later by Florida law enforcement. And most of these assassinations and attempted assassinations are fairly cut and dry. The motive and the means for carrying out the hit are clear. But there are some, most notably the assassination of President Kennedy, that continue to spark all kinds of conspiracy theories. The circumstances surrounding the 2 attempts on Donald Trump's life are also heavily debated, and I'm sure will be for many years to come. Generally, the most plausible explanation turns out to be true. But you can hardly blame people for thinking the worst, especially when the government is involved. And why is that, you might ask? Well, it turns out that the government has a history of lying. Don't believe me? Check out our latest video explaining some of the lies and false flags the government has engaged in. It might just change your perception on the world around you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm Dennis Gill for Revealing History.